The trouble began with a line drawn on a map and a sentence in a binder. At first, it was the kind of administrative tangle that eats away at people slowly. A clause in the HOA bylaws. An ambiguous plat map scanned and stapled into a meeting packet. An officious letter folded into an envelope and left on a porch. He kept the letter for a day like a paper cut, flipping it open in the kitchen while coffee steamed and the children's toys lay where he'd left them the night before. The envelope carried the HOA seal and the kind of language that felt final. Even when it was merely procedural, community property, encroachment, corrective action required. It named a strip of his land, a shadow of a corner between his lawn and the old iron fence, and called it not his but common area. The claim was small on paper and huge everywhere else. The strip was where the dog chased the mail carrier and where he planted his late mother's rosebush. It was where, in summer, his child kicked a soccer ball until dusk, and where he would sit after long shifts, letting the neighborhood noise fade into the hum of crickets. To him it was memory and ownership. To the HOA it was a technicality, a line to be enforced, a resource to be standardized. The first notice demanded removal of unauthorized landscaping and warned of fines escalating weekly. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a tap on the shoulder that quickly became a shove. She lived directly across the street in a spotless beige home with symmetrical hedges and a driveway that gleamed like polished marble. She was the kind of neighbor who seemed to have been born with a clipboard in hand. Karen didn't introduce herself. Instead, she began by photographing my house from various angles, jotting notes, and occasionally shaking her head for dramatic effect. The real blow landed one morning when I discovered a formal violation notice taped to my front door. The wording was sharper this time. Your property's appearance has been deemed detrimental to neighborhood property values. Immediate action is required. Attached was a recommendation to repaint the house, replace the antique shutters, remove the wrought iron fence, and trim back the overgrown ivy that climbed my walls. The violation notice was signed by none other than Karen, the HOA's Community Standards Chairperson. That evening, I stood across the street and looked at my own home from her perspective. I understood what she saw, an aging structure with deep shadows under its eaves, an irregular roofline, As twilight settled and streetlights hummed to life, he sat on his porch and watched the neighborhood process what had happened. The dispute had become spectacle, and spectacle was a force that rearranged loyalties. Those who supported the HOA recoiled and sharpened their rhetoric. Those who resented uniformity found in him a champion with a shovel and a vision. The battle had left the neat, measured world of bylaws and moved into one of images and impressions, where a single, well-framed photo could do what a binder never could: tell a story that people would remember. A week later, an envelope arrived with heavier paper and the promise of escalation. The board had hired an attorney. The letter used language that suggested inevitability, yet the moat remained, a shallow but stubborn geography that had turned his quiet dispute into a public spectacle. It had raised more than water. It had raised questions about power, ownership, what a community would tolerate when one of its members refused to be folded into sameness. For the first time, the man realized that the struggle would demand more than stubbornness and a backhoe. It would demand strategy, allies, and the kind of endurance that outlasts headlines. The night closed around the street, and the moat reflected porch lights like a small, defiant mirror. He walked the perimeter and felt the damp air rise from the earth. In his hands, the original notice felt like tinder. From the shallow trench, from the rosebush's uncompromised bloom, from the thin line between private grief and public principle, a new chapter was ready to be written. The HOA had drawn a line. He had dug one. The neighborhood had taken sides, and somewhere between law and legend, the story began to move. When the legal letter came, it carried all the calm menace of professionals trained to make chaos seem routine. It was an attorney's letterhead, an enumerated list of alleged violations, and a polite invitation to mediate. The HOA offered compromise in the language of contracts: remove the moat, restore the lawn to acceptable community standards, or face legal action. The board's lawyer described penalties and costs in neutral tones, as though the removal of his trench were merely a municipal detail. But the man read every sentence as if he were pulling the teeth from a predator. The clauses were form, the intent was control. He did not retreat. The moat had done something greater than keep water. It created an image that had rippled beyond the cul-de-sac. Videos uploaded by neighbors were shared on community pages, and then, like a small bonfire, spread through larger feeds. People outside. The neighborhood began to weigh in with comments that fused amusement and outrage. The mayor's office received emails. A local blog published an article that framed the moat as a question of the century. What happens when HOA rules collide with individual expression? Radio talk shows picked it up. The story acquired a new layer. The dispute was no longer between a homeowner and a board. It was between individuals and systems that prized conformity over memory. His inbox filled with messages. Some were supportive and anonymous. Others came from strangers who had faced similar cruelties. A woman from a different state wrote about an oak tree that had been cut down for visual uniformity. An elderly man sent scanned copies of paperwork proving ownership of a century-old property and promising moral solidarity. Local activists connected him with a pro bono attorney known for taking on small-town power networks. The attorney's emails had the tone of someone who had seen too many David versus Goliath stories end badly, and who nevertheless loved taking on uneven fights. She asked for deeds and surveys and told him how to document drainage and jurisdiction. She warned him about safety and liability but did not push him to disassemble the moat. The board, sensing the narrative slipping from their control, shifted tactics. They began to document minor infractions across the neighborhood with renewed enthusiasm, an operation that smelled of distraction. They sent notices about unapproved holiday decorations and misaligned mailboxes, as if to remind everyone on the block that the same rulebook could be used to tidy dissent. Their emails to residents framed the moat as escalatory behavior, a phrase designed to make anyone uncomfortable with activism feel foolish. The HOA president titled their letters with words like restoration and community standards, and spoke in the measured voice of those The scandal that followed was not explosive in the way tabloids imagine. It was a gradual unspooling. A canceled invoice here, a questionable vendor contract there, series of complaints that had been dismissed without record. For months, the HOA had enforced standards with a kind of righteous certainty. But as the cracks in the leadership became visible, their moral authority thinned. Residents who had once nodded at meetings began to ask for audited records. The board responded defensively, invoking confidentiality and the sanctity of internal processes. But the public bandwidth had shifted away from calm compliance toward curiosity and suspicion as this unspooling took place. The moat became a pilgrimage, site of sorts. Neighbors left small bottles of water at its edge, a playful tribute to the idea it had resurrected. Children put toy boats in the water and watched them circle the rosebush like tiny siege vessels. Local reporters came to take photographs and to ask questions about property rights and community standards. The mayor's office alerted The romance of the moat's origin persisted in the cultural memory of the neighborhood. Children still played at its edges, and elders told the story of the rosebush and the trench over coffee as if reciting a parable. The man found himself less interested in spectacle and more invested in the slow work of repairing relationships and building communal resilience. He volunteered on committees and helped repair a community gazebo. He insisted privately and publicly that rules matter when applied fairly. In this way, he transformed from rebel to reluctant statesman, a person whose defiant act had placed him at the center of a broader civic conversation, even as some wounds healed. Whispers about the HOA president's leadership gnawed at the edges. An independent audit was demanded by residents and eventually authorized. The audit revealed a pattern of approvals and vendor selections that did not always align with transparent, equitable decision-making. The board faced consequences. Members resigned, some reluctantly, and some because they had misjudged the neighborhood's tolerance for opaque governance. The president, who had once navigated meetings with the confidence of someone who considered herself indispensable, found her authority diminished. When the board restructured and new elections were held, the mood of the neighborhood shifted. The new board emphasized openness, a more collaborative approach to bylaws, and the creation of a resident oversight committee. The man's moat had done more than preserve land. It had catalyzed civic participation. People who had once deferred to the board found their voices again, and the neighborhood adopted a new habit of questioning decisions. It was, in its small way, a reclaiming of public life from the hands that had tightened around it. But the story was not yet over. While the HOA's internal problems had been exposed and addressed, the legal aftermath still lingered. As seasons turned, the moat thrummed with life. Frogs nested in reeds, dragonflies skimmed the surface. Children learned the names of insects. The rosebush, once a private memorial, developed into a communal point of affection. The man continued, his small, steady labors of maintenance, of ensuring safety and preserving ecology. He thought often of the strange arc of things, a line on a map, bureaucratic letter, a piece of earth dug into a trench, and then a community transformed. He recognized that change had costs, fractured relationships, weeks spent in court, the burden of becoming a boogeyman for some and a hero for others. Yet the transformation had also produced something the bylaws could not foresee, renewed civic energy that insisted on fairness and the dignity of private life. The moat had been built in anger and installed as a defense, but over time, it became an instrument of education and renewal. It taught neighbors to ask for records, to demand clarity, and to remember that rules should not be used to erase memory.